Something feels wrong about these woods, and I knew it the moment I stepped past the old fence line. It wasn't the cold air or the way the trees creaked overhead. It wasn't even the silence, thick enough to feel like a weight pressing against my ears. It was something else, something watching, something waiting. If you've ever walked into a place that felt alive in all the wrong ways, then you'll understand what I mean. That's why I'm here to tell you this story, because something sinister lurks in the woods. I have rules to survive it, and if you ever find yourself anywhere near this forest, you'll want to know those rules too. I didn't grow up believing in supernatural things. I wasn't the kind of person who jumped at shadows or got nervous at the thought of being alone. But the first night I spent near these trees, everything changed. Before I ever heard the first whisper or saw those strange movements between the branches, I felt the shift, like the forest noticed me and marked me. I wish I could explain it better, but some things you don't understand until they happen to you. And from that point on, everything I thought I knew about the world started to fall apart. It all began when I moved into a small cabin on the edge of the woods. I took the place because it was cheap and quiet, perfect for someone trying to restart their life. I thought peace was what I needed. I thought isolation would help me think clearly, breathe freely, and rebuild. But the woods had other plans. On my first day there, the owner handed me a folded piece of paper. On it, written in shaky handwriting, were a set of rules. He didn't smile, didn't explain, didn't even meet my eyes. He just pressed the paper into my hand and walked away. I should have asked more questions, but I didn't. Not then. Not until it was too late. The rules were simple at first glance, yet oddly specific. Don't whistle after dark. Never leave food outside overnight. Never look out the window between 2 a.m. and 2:10 a.m. Even stranger, one of the rules said, if you hear your name whispered from the forest, do not respond. I remember staring at the list and laughing to myself. I figured the old man was trying to scare me or keep me from wandering out and getting lost. After all, people talk about the woods like they're unpredictable, full of animals, cliffs, and hidden paths that can turn dangerous fast. I didn't know then that the danger wasn't the land. It was something in it. The first night was calm, almost peaceful. The wind drifted softly through the trees, and the moonlight painted everything silver. I slept easily, thinking maybe this move was exactly what I needed. But the second night was different. The air felt heavier, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I woke up suddenly, unsure why, only to notice that the cabin felt colder than before, unnaturally cold. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave. I tried to shake it off as the weather changing, but then the sound started. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It was faint, like someone walking through dry leaves far off, just barely close enough for me to hear. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or fox. But the steps were too slow. Too deliberate. Like whatever was moving didn't need to rush. Like it knew exactly where I was. I told myself not to be paranoid. I didn't want to be the kind of person who frightened themselves with random noises in the night. But then I remembered the rules. And when I did, I realized something. I didn't remember closing the window blinds before going to bed. My heart started beating faster. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to check. But fear has a strange way of making you want answers, even when answers are the last thing you should search for. I pulled myself out of bed, slow and careful, each step feeling like I was walking toward something I shouldn't see. When I reached the window, I didn't look out. I forced myself to pull the blinds closed as fast as I could, and the moment they snapped shut, the footsteps stopped. Just like that. Silence rushed in so quickly it felt like the entire forest was listening. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I imagined everything. People hear strange things at night all the time. But when I stepped outside, I found something in the dirt near my cabin. Something that made every hair on my body stand up. A footprint. Not an animal's, not a human's. Something in between. Something wrong. The ground around it was undisturbed, like only the single step had been taken. Like it wanted me to see it. From there, the rules began to make more sense. Not logically, but instinctively. The forest wasn't normal. There was something sinister living in it, something that watched from the shadows and moved without sound when it wanted to. Something that understood far more than it should. As the days passed, I started noticing more signs. The feeling of being watched became constant. Birds stopped singing when I walked outside. The trees seemed to lean in closer. And sometimes, at night, soft whispers drifted through the walls, as though the forest itself was trying to talk to me. But the whispering wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the night I heard my name. It was faint, almost gentle, carried through the darkness like a breath. I froze instantly. Every muscle locked. Every thought vanished. I knew I shouldn't respond. I knew one of the rules warned against exactly this. But knowing something and having the strength to follow it are two different things. My name echoed again, a little closer this time. And then again. Each time it sounded more familiar, as if it were trying to imitate someone I trusted. Someone I loved. Someone it thought I would answer to. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. That was 3 nights ago. Since then, things have only gotten worse. The rules, once strange and unnecessary, now feel like my only lifeline. I follow them without question, without hesitation, because I've learned one thing. The forest doesn't just watch. It adapts. It learns. And it wants something. What it wants, I'm still trying to figure out. But something tells me I'm running out of time. And tonight, something new is happening. Something that wasn't on the list of rules. Something the old man never warned me about. As I sit here telling you this, the woods are silent, too silent, and the shadows outside my door are moving even though nothing is there. If I make it through tonight, I'll tell you what happens next. But if I don't, remember the rules. They might be the only thing standing between you and whatever's waiting just beyond the tree line. I've spent hours pacing the cabin tonight, trying to make sense of everything that's happening. The forest outside is quiet, but I know that quiet can be more dangerous than noise. It's the kind of silence that hides movement, that waits for you to let your guard down. Every shadow seems sharper, every tree seems taller, and I keep catching glimpses of things moving just beyond the edge of my vision. I tell myself it's my imagination, but deep down, I know it isn't. This forest is alive and it doesn't want me here. The old man who sold me the cabin didn't tell me much, but I've tried piecing together what I can. From what I've gathered, this area has always had a reputation. People talk about hikers disappearing, campers who never come back, and strange lights flickering in the trees at night. Some say it's cursed, some say it's haunted, and some just call it dangerous and avoid it altogether. I thought those were just stories, the kind meant to scare newcomers and keep kids from wandering off the paths. But the moment I stepped into these woods, I realized the stories didn't begin to cover the truth. They were only the warning signs for those who never survived long enough to write their own warnings. I think about the rules constantly now. I've started keeping a notebook, writing down everything I notice, the sounds, the shapes, the patterns. It's the only way I can make sense of the forest. The rules are there to protect me, yes, but they're also a puzzle. Some of them make sense. Don't leave food outside or you'll attract animals. Don't whistle after dark, maybe because it calls something that shouldn't hear you. But others are far stranger. Don't look out the window between 2 a.m. and 2:10 a.m. Why those exact 10 minutes? Why whispering my name is dangerous? I don't have the answers, and I fear the only way I'll find them is by paying attention to what happens when I break them, even just a little. There's a pattern in the things I've observed. The movement in the shadows isn't random. It's deliberate. It's patient. Sometimes it mimics sounds from the cabin or footsteps, or even my voice if I'm not careful. I catch it out of the corner of my eye, a tree branch twitching where no wind blows, a shadow crossing the path outside that doesn't belong to any animal. And sometimes I think I see faces. Faces that vanish as soon as I look directly at them, leaving nothing but the feeling that I've been watched. I can't tell if they're real or just tricks my mind is playing to survive the fear. I've tried to retrace the history of the forest, digging through old newspapers and online records. Years ago, there was a series of unexplained disappearances in this exact area. Hunters, hikers, even some locals, people who knew the land well. The reports always ended with vague statements like, investigation inconclusive, or no trace found. But the way I look at it, someone, or something, was always there hiding in plain sight. Maybe that's what the old man meant when he gave me the rules. Maybe he survived because he learned them early and maybe everyone else didn't. At night, the whispers are the worst. They start soft, almost like a breeze brushing across your ears. Sometimes they call out random words, sometimes fragments of sentences I can't quite make sense of. And then, sometimes they use my name. That moment freezes me every single time. My muscles lock, my chest tightens, and I know that even the slightest response could be dangerous. I've learned not to fight it with logic. Logic doesn't work here. Only following the rules, staying quiet, and paying attention can keep me safe. During the day, the forest feels different. Less threatening but still unsettling. The trees seem to watch me, leaning slightly in ways that shouldn't be possible. Shadows stretch in odd directions. The air smells faintly of decay, even when I haven't noticed any natural source. Sometimes I'll be out gathering wood or checking the perimeter of the cabin, and I'll feel the unmistakable sensation of being followed. No matter how many times I turn around, I never see anyone. But the signs are there, the broken branches, footprints in the dirt that appear where I swear no one walked, and the eerie feeling that the forest knows where I am at all times. I've tried reaching out to neighbors, calling local authorities, even posting online about the strange things I've noticed. But the few people I managed to contact either shrugged it off, said I was imagining things, or refused to go near the forest altogether. One old hiker warned me once, "Some places in these woods aren't meant for living, not for the likes of us. You follow the rules, you might survive. You break them, you won't." I didn't ask for details, but his tone told me more than any story could. There's something here that doesn't play by our rules, something patient, intelligent, and very old. I've started keeping a routine, following the rules meticulously. Some nights I sit by the window just after sunset, listening for sounds and taking notes, making sure I don't cross any boundaries the forest has silently set. Other nights, I stay completely still in bed, trying not to breathe too loudly, praying that nothing notices me. I've realized that survival here isn't about fighting. It's about understanding, observing, and respecting the unknown rules of something that exists beyond normal explanation. And yet, despite all the fear, there's a part of me that can't stop exploring. A part that wants to understand the forest fully, to know why it's alive, why it calls my name, and what it wants from me. I've begun marking the paths, taking notes on where the shadows seem to move the most, listening for patterns in the whispers. I tell myself it's research, but deep down I know it's curiosity, dangerous, foolish curiosity that may be exactly what the forest is waiting for. I've also started noticing signs that I'm not the first person to survive here, at least temporarily. Old carvings on tree trunks, faded markings on rocks, tiny symbols etched into the ground near the cabin. I don't understand them yet, but I keep them in mind, hoping that one day I'll piece them together and maybe figure out how some people make it out alive. Maybe they were like me, following rules, learning the ways of the forest, slowly adapting to survive. The strangest part is that sometimes, when I walk deep into the woods during daylight, I get a sense of being guided. Not like a friendly hand, but a force that pushes me forward, as if it wants me to see something, or maybe to lead me into a trap. I can't tell which. Every time I try to get closer to whatever it is, the feeling vanishes. The shadows shift. The whispers stop. And I end up back at the edge of the cabin, wondering if I imagined it all, or if the forest is testing me, seeing how much I can handle before it decides I'm ready, or not. I don't know how long I can keep this up. Following the rules has kept me alive so far, but every night, it feels like the forest is growing bolder. The whispers are louder. The movement's closer. And the sense of being watched is constant now, even when I close my eyes and try to escape in sleep. Something is learning me, studying me, and I have no idea what it wants or how it will strike if I make the wrong move. For now, all I can do is watch, listen, and write. I hope that by understanding this place I can survive long enough to figure out its secrets. But one thing is certain, the forest isn't going anywhere, and neither is whatever lurks in it. The nights have grown longer, heavier, like the darkness itself is pressing against the cabin walls. I can no longer tell where the forest ends and the shadows begin. Every creak in the wooden floor, every gust of wind rattling the window, feels like a signal that I'm being watched more closely than ever. The rules have become my lifeline, but following them is exhausting, mentally and physically. Sleep offers no reprieve. Dreams are filled with dark corridors of trees, whispers calling my name, shapes gliding just out of reach. I wake up sweating, heart pounding, and realize that even the daylight hours feel like a trap. Earlier today I found more signs, symbols carved into trees in patterns I hadn't noticed before. Unlike the previous markings, these seemed more recent, fresher, almost urgent. I traced them carefully, feeling an unease that gnawed at my chest. The shapes were too precise to be random, too deliberate to be harmless. I realized that the forest is not only alive, it's communicating directly with me. And that thought made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to ignore it. I went about my day chopping wood and cleaning the cabin, reminding myself to stay calm, to stick to the rules. But then the whispers started again. Low at first, almost gentle, but they quickly grew louder, more insistent. My name echoed through the trees, carried in voices that sounded both familiar and wrong, like someone I loved calling me from far away, distorted by something unnatural. I forced myself to stay inside, shutting every door, closing every blind, refusing to answer. But the tension built with every second. By late afternoon I felt something new, a presence moving outside, closer, more deliberate. I could sense it pacing around the cabin, circling in ways I couldn't predict. It wasn't just observing anymore, it was testing me, trying to see if I would break the rules even in the smallest ways. I stayed still, heart hammering, counting the seconds, whispering reminders to myself. Don't respond. Don't move. Don't show fear. And then the first strike came. Something slammed against the cabin wall. Wood splintered slightly and a cold wind blew through the cracks. I pressed myself against the floor, forcing every breath to be silent, convinced that if I moved even slightly it would know. And I could feel it, watching, listening, learning. I realized that the forest had moved from subtle tests to active challenges, forcing me to make split-second decisions just to stay alive. The journal I found weeks ago became my lifeline. I retraced every note, every warning, and suddenly passages that had seemed minor took on new importance. There were hints about how the previous inhabitant had survived certain nights, mentions of hiding, observing patterns, and moving only when the forest allowed it. I studied those passages, memorized them, and tried to predict the next steps. But prediction was difficult. The forest doesn't move according to logic. It adapts, responds, and punishes curiosity if it senses weakness. Night fell faster than usual. The wind carried a strange scent, earthy and metallic, the kind that makes your stomach twist. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the cabin, and the whispers escalated into a chorus that made my blood run cold. Shapes moved between the trees with a precision that I couldn't track, like a predator rehearsing its approach. Every instinct screamed at me that this was the most dangerous night yet, that whatever was testing me was ready to strike. Then I noticed the footprints outside the door. They were not human. Not entirely. Large, uneven, with a rhythm that suggested intelligence. They led to the cabin, stopped, and circled back without leaving the slightest trace of hesitation. Whoever, or whatever, made them was aware I was inside. It had been waiting, watching, calculating. I realized with a sinking feeling that the forest had escalated. The subtle signs, the whispers, the movements, they were all tests to draw me into a trap. Now I was at the edge and the climax of the danger was here. I tried to calm myself, repeating the rules over and over, keeping my breathing steady, moving only when necessary. I listened as the sounds of the forest converged outside. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the soft shuffling of footsteps, whispers overlapping with familiar voices. The forest wasn't just surrounding me, it was closing in, narrowing my options. My mind raced, trying to anticipate its next move, but the forest was always a step ahead. Every shadow held potential threat, every sound a warning. Hours felt like minutes, minutes like hours. The whispers began mimicking my own voice, repeating words I had said aloud earlier in the day. The effect was terrifying. It was as if the forest knew my thoughts, my fears, and was reflecting them back to me, twisting them into something monstrous. I felt cornered, trapped in a living nightmare, where every instinct to survive was being tested to its absolute limit. And then the movement started directly outside the window. I could see branches bending, shadows shifting closer. A shape moved along the edge of the cabin, something tall, deliberate, almost humanoid but wrong in ways I couldn't describe. Its presence radiated intelligence and malice, and I realized that the forest itself was channeling this being, using every tool it had learned from watching me over the past days. My pulse pounded, my hands shook, but I clung to the rules. I didn't look directly, I didn't respond, I didn't breathe too loudly. I felt a cold, calculated awareness studying me, testing me. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, calling my name, and then, suddenly, they stopped. Silence. So complete that my own heartbeat sounded deafening. I held my breath, terrified to even blink, knowing that the next moment would decide everything. Something shifted in the air. The shadows seemed to lean in closer, stretching unnaturally toward the cabin walls. The temperature dropped sharply and my entire body went rigid. I could feel it. Whatever had been waiting, whatever had been learning, was preparing to act. The forest wasn't just a backdrop anymore. It had become a predator. And I was standing at the edge of something far beyond ordinary fear, on the threshold of a night that could change everything. I gripped the edge of the table, staring into the darkness outside, listening to the almost imperceptible movements, counting every second. My mind raced through the rules, through every clue in the journal, trying to anticipate what would happen next. And I knew deep down that I was no longer just surviving. I was part of the forest now, part of the game it was playing, part of the mystery I had dared to enter. Whatever happens next, I realized, will demand everything of me. Every ounce of courage, every lesson learned, every rule memorized will be tested to the extreme. And as the shadows pressed closer and the whispers edged into my consciousness, I could feel the climax approaching. The moment when the forest would finally reveal what it wanted, and when the rules might no longer be enough to keep me alive. The wind howled through the trees, the cabin walls groaned, and the silence between movements stretched longer than ever. I could hear it breathing, or at least I thought I could, and in that pause I knew the forest had drawn a line. The next move would decide everything. Just when I thought the night couldn't get any worse, I heard it, a second sound, faint at first but unmistakable. It wasn't the shuffling of branches or the whispering from the shadows. It was footsteps. Inside the cabin. My blood froze. I had locked every door, every window, every possible entry point. I was alone, or so I thought. My heart slammed against my chest as I realized something impossible. Whatever was outside the forest had found a way in. The footsteps stopped abruptly, then shifted, pacing in a way that mimicked mine from earlier that evening. A strange, cold realization hit me. The forest wasn't just surrounding me anymore. It was manipulating space, bending reality around the cabin, testing me in ways I couldn't anticipate. Every instinct screamed to hide, to flee, but even that seemed futile. I was trapped in a place that didn't play by any normal rules. I gripped the edge of the table and whispered the rules to myself like a mantra. Don't respond. Don't move. Don't show fear. But then came a sound I couldn't ignore, a voice. Not the whispering of my name, not the overlapping voices of the forest, but a clear, calm, almost human voice coming from the corner of the room. You're not supposed to be here. I froze. My mind raced. How could there be another person? And more importantly, had they survived? Or had they become part of the forest like the others? I strained my eyes into the shadows and saw movement, just a flicker at first, then more defined. A figure stepping out of the darkness, tall, thin, almost blending into the walls. Its face was obscured, but the presence radiated control and menace. This wasn't just the forest anymore. This was something, or someone, that had learned how to invade my space, to reach me in ways I never expected. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to remember the rules. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe too heavily. The figure paused, then leaned slightly, tilting its head as if studying me. My chest ached with fear and my mind spun with questions. Was this the forest taking form? Or was it a previous inhabitant, someone, or something, that had survived, adapted, and now merged with the dark intelligence of the woods? Then, as if to answer my unspoken questions, the figure whispered again, softer this time, "You've learned some rules, but not all." It stepped closer, and for the first time I felt its eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, burn into me. It was aware, calculating, testing the limits of my courage. The stakes had escalated beyond survival of simple rules. Now, understanding and intuition mattered, and I realized with horror that I had no idea how far the forest, and whatever it created, was willing to go. The shadows outside the cabin shifted in tandem with the figure's movements, as if the forest itself had lent its strength. Leaves rustled unnaturally, branches bent, and a low hum reverberated through the walls. I realized the forest was no longer a passive entity, it was actively collaborating with this presence, amplifying its power. The rules I had clung to for survival suddenly seemed fragile, inadequate against an intelligence that had grown far beyond any simple boundary or warning. I tried to steady my thoughts, flipping through the old journal in my mind, recalling every lesson, every clue, every pattern I'd observed. Yet nothing prepared me for this. Every instinct told me to hide, but my curiosity, my need to understand, kept me frozen in place. I understood then that the forest wasn't merely a test of fear anymore, it was testing my very choices, my judgment, my ability to read what was real and what was manipulation. The figure took another step closer, and I noticed something that made my stomach turn. It was wearing scraps of clothing that looked old, tattered, pieces of fabric that matched descriptions in the previous inhabitant's journal. Whoever, or whatever, this was, it had survived long enough to claim fragments of the past, to learn, to adapt. And now, it was here to push me further than I had ever been pushed. Outside, the forest reacted violently. The wind howled like a chorus of voices, leaves swirled into unnatural spirals, and the shadows thickened, crawling up the walls like black tendrils. The cabin felt like a vessel in a storm, a small, fragile piece of wood standing against a force that bent reality to its will. My mind raced, my pulse threatening to betray me, but I knew one slip could trigger the end. One wrong look, one breath too loud, one instinctive reaction, and the forest would strike. I could feel it watching every twitch of my muscles, every micro-expression. It wasn't just about following the rules anymore. It was about proving my understanding, my awareness, my ability to survive when the boundaries themselves were no longer enough. The whispers intensified, now echoing from all directions, overlapping with the voice of the figure, each word a knife teasing my nerves. "You're learning, but not fast enough," it hissed. My body trembled as I realized something terrifying. I was not the hunter. I was the prey. And this second twist, the presence inside the cabin, was the proof. The forest had escalated its game. It was no longer testing rules or boundaries. It was testing me directly, probing my fear, my judgment, my very will to survive. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this was just the beginning of the night, the beginning of the real climax that would push me to the edge of everything I thought I could handle. I gripped the edge of the table, counting my breaths, trying to find a thread of calm, knowing that the forest, the figure, and the shadows were all waiting for me to break. Waiting for the smallest mistake to unravel everything. And as I stared into the darkness, the whispers blending into the wind, the shadows crawling ever closer, I realized that the climax was approaching faster than I had ever imagined, and nothing would ever feel safe again. The moment came faster than I expected. The figure stepped fully into the dim light of the cabin, revealing a face that made my stomach twist, half human, half warped, like it had been shaped by the forest itself. Its eyes gleamed with a strange intelligence, reflecting everything I feared, everything I didn't understand. For a heartbeat we just stared at each other, the air thick with tension so sharp it hurt to breathe. Then it spoke again, calm, deliberate. "You've learned the rules. You know what to do. But can you act when the rules aren't enough?" I realized then that this was the ultimate test. It wasn't about avoiding mistakes or staying silent. It was about instinct, awareness, and courage. I had to act, to decide, and to challenge the force that had been manipulating me from the shadows. My mind raced. Every rule I'd memorized, every observation from the journal, every warning from the forest itself, they all converged into a single, urgent thought: survive. The figure lunged suddenly, impossibly fast, and I ducked instinctively, grabbing the nearest heavy object, a wooden chair, and swung. It passed through empty space, a blur, and the shadows around it seemed to ripple, almost alive, reacting to every movement. The forest's whispers turned into a cacophony, overlapping with my own racing heartbeat. I realized that fighting it head-on would only get me killed. Instead, I focused on the patterns I had observed, the subtle signs that told me where it wasn't, where it hesitated. I moved deliberately, stepping in rhythm with the forest's cues, whispering my own rules to myself under my breath. Every step, every breath, every motion had to be calculated. The figure mirrored me at first, matching my movements, testing my instincts. Then gradually, I noticed a shift. It hesitated, flickers of uncertainty breaking the perfect confidence it had carried all this time. My pulse pounded, but I pressed on, using my knowledge of the forest itself to create distance, to outmaneuver something that had seemed unstoppable. Outside, the wind picked up violently, branches thrashing against the cabin like claws. Shadows stretched and warped across the walls, but I kept my focus, following the safest path I had marked earlier. The figure moved erratically now, the forest reacting unpredictably as if it too was struggling to anticipate my next steps. I realized that the forest wasn't invincible. It relied on fear, hesitation, and instinct to control its prey. And tonight I refused to give in. With one final, deliberate action, I lured the figure toward the edge of the cabin, using a broken window as bait. The instant it lunged, I darted in the opposite direction, feeling the energy of the forest surge behind it, carrying the figure with it into the darkness outside. There was a violent, almost screaming howl that echoed through the trees, the shadows convulsing as if the forest itself had been wounded. I stood there, gasping, heart racing, knowing I had survived, but understanding that nothing about this place would ever be simple again. For the first time since I arrived, the whispers stopped. The shadows receded slightly, and the wind fell silent, leaving only the heavy, charged air of the cabin. I sank to the floor, trembling, trying to process what had happened. I had faced the forest's greatest test, confronted the figure it had used to manipulate me, and survived. But survival didn't feel like victory, it felt like a pause, a fragile calm before something else inevitably came. Then I heard it, a sound so familiar it made my stomach drop. My own name, whispered softly from the corner of the cabin. I froze, heart hammering, convinced it was another test, another illusion. But this time, it didn't come from outside the shadows. It came from the journal I had relied on all these weeks. Slowly, trembling, I opened the last pages I hadn't read. Inside, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were words that made my blood run cold. The forest survives not by fear, but by choice. Tonight, it let you live, but survival is not freedom. It chooses its prey, and one day it will call you again. I realized with a shiver that the forest had never truly been the enemy. The figure, the whispers, the shadows, they were tools, ways to test the boundaries of will and understanding. But the real danger was the forest itself, patient, intelligent, and eternal. It could allow me to live, even thrive, but only on its terms and only as long as it desired. I stepped to the window, looking out into the dark trees. The shadows had settled, but something lingered just beyond the sight of my eyes. The air pulsed with the unspoken awareness of the forest, as if it had absorbed everything I had done tonight and was silently evaluating. I had won the night, but the forest had won in a different way. It had reminded me that survival was never absolute. It was always temporary, fragile, and unpredictable. And then, from the far edge of the clearing, a faint movement caught my attention. A figure, smaller this time, almost human, watching. Not attacking. Just observing. I realized with a start that it wasn't alone. The forest had more eyes, more intelligence, more patience than I could ever comprehend. And in that moment I understood the final, cruel twist. Survival wasn't an ending. It was only another beginning. I backed away from the window, heart pounding, realizing that I was part of the forest story now, and it would decide when, and how, it wanted to continue the game. The whispers started again, soft, gentle, almost inviting. I didn't answer. I didn't move. But deep down, I knew the forest was patient, and my next test was already waiting. The night had ended, but the forest's lesson had only just begun.